I want to say hi, Seth. Welcome.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for
I'm
having me.
really looking forward to your talk titled Entering Astrophotography Without Fear. Just to give everybody a little bit of a background on Seth.
Okay.
He retired as the superintendent of schools in Tupper Lake last July. He began his career as an educator as an instrumental music teacher in 1987. Seth's interest in astronomy, though, began at the age of 5 when he received his first telescope. Having grown up in the Bronx, New York, there were few opportunities to view the night sky. However, his fascination with the night sky has always been part of his life. Seth's involvement with the Adirondack and Sky Center and Observatory began in 2015, where he is currently the vice president, as well as chairperson of the Education Committee. Seth's hope is to continue to improve his own astrophotography and to continue to expand the Adirondack Sky Center and Observatory's annual 4-day Astrophotography Conference, which I think he's going to be giving us a little bit of information about as well. So take it away, Seth.
All right, thanks. And boy, it's a thrill to be here. I was happy to sit in for part of your meeting. And the presentation tonight, Entering Astrophotography Without Fear, is exactly right. And I add the little tagline, not for experts only, because entering astrophotography is a whole realm unto itself. And that's why I'm here tonight. But Alex said that I could shamelessly plug what we're about to do in Tupper Lake with the Science Museum that we're building on our existing observatory site. This Astro Science Center Museum will be an 18,000 square foot science facility dedicated to astronomy and space travel, both of which of course are extremely relevant as we're about to leave Earth for extended periods of time. There's nothing more inspiring and awesome than the night sky, as you in particular already know. And the skies here in the Adirondack are a perfect place for their spectacular views and a perfect place to build a museum and observatory. This $15 million Astro Science Center will facilitate both education and entertainment in a way that's interactive between exhibits and visitors. When finished, the museum will feature a state-of-the-art planetarium, a 30-foot dome, which will seat 65 visitors. Additionally, a large theater will allow us to do lectures, classes, and host our annual astrophotography event, which I will tell you more about later. Exhibits are planned to include a so-called pendulum, overhead model of our solar system, historical collections, both permanent and traveling, and a large area for hands-on and interactive activities. It's our mission to make this museum an immersive experience for everyone. This will never be a look and don't touch opportunity. This building, in addition to our existing roll-off observatory, which houses 4 permanently mounted telescopes, is the final phase of construction. And in that is a plan for a traditional observatory housing a new 22-inch research-grade telescope. So feel free to contact us if you're interested in becoming a member or perhaps making a $15 million donation to our cause. And if that's the case, you're going to get your name on a building, I suspect. So with that, thank you for allowing me to shamelessly plug this organization and our capital project, which I'm very proud to be part of. So by now you're probably thinking to yourself, all right, so who is this guy exactly? And as Alex said, I'm a recently retired superintendent of schools. I started off as a music teacher, the band guy. I was a technology coordinator in the district, installed the first wide area network in a district in the Adirondack Park. Became a building administrator, district superintendent finally, and retired recently on July 1st. And of course, it's been cloudy every night since July 1st. Here's what I'm not though, and I want to make this perfectly clear. I am not a scientist. I'm barely an astronomer, although I'm getting there, but I'm no way an expert. I'm a very beginning astrophotographer, and I'm spreading the gospel of the phrase, well, if this guy can do it, so can I. And as Alex said, we are in the dark skies of the Adirondacks, but I grew up in the Bronx. And when I was a kid, I thought there was just the moon and the sun, and rarely at that. So my astrophotography career just started just a few years ago on my own, very frustrated in the dark and cold. And that's why I'm here to help those who are at the gates, but a little intimidated by Am I not muted? Am I?
I'm sorry. I'm
You're-
sorry, Seth. I accidentally muted you.
Oh, okay.
My bad.
Should I start back at the beginning, or are we, how
No,
far?
that
just,
was-
just the
you
last
said-
5 seconds.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. Anyway, so that's kind of my story. I started astrophotography just a few years ago, in the dark by myself, trying to find YouTube videos of how to capture images on a camera for astrophotography, and it was very frustrating. So that's why I'm here, to spread the word. So this is now the tonight is versus the tonight isn't slide. And I suspect this is where some experts may exit our party tonight. My goal tonight is to give an overview of the image capturing process. We won't be discussing processing at all, really. We'll do some pre-processing, but only if we have time. You'll be able to find processing tutorials. Everybody does processing tutorials online. There's classes for it, but nobody does the courses on this is what it's supposed to look like inside your camera. This is what it comes out like when you take your first picture. You can do that in the you can do that processing workshop in the living room of your own home in the warm, not out in the cold. I'm going to show you my early pictures. I'm going to show you that there are mistakes. There are no great pictures in here. Incidentally, kudos to those of you who had images at the beginning during the meeting. Those were stunning. So most of you are, fantastic, very impressive. I'm going to try to talk in terms that's understandable. I'm going to go through a step-by-step process of each setup that we use, and I'm going to start with the simplest and move to more complex ones. Having said that, it's important to note that the principles that we talk about, even at the early stages, apply to the most complex setups that we have. So that's sort of the idea of what tonight is and what tonight isn't. So don't plan to see any stunning photographs tonight. You're going to see my beginning astrophotography, and this is what you should expect your beginning astrophotography to look at. So I say entering astrophotography without fear, not for experts only. What is it that we're afraid of? What is that fear? What's keeping us, what kept me at the gate before I would burst in and really try to do it? Well, like anything, there's jargon that you don't understand. So it's like a whole new language. There's time, certainly. There is absolutely expense. It's freezing cold in the winter, and there's bugs in the summer. And not to mention the clouds that interrupt your best opportunities. And I say not for experts only, because sometimes experts can't really understand what the frustration is. And I'm going to just pick on engineers for a minute. They're the worst. They assume a base of understanding about the world that most of us mortals don't have. So of course, I'm kidding. Engineers, don't send me hateful email. But when you need a question asked, you want a direct answer. And I've been very frustrated over the years that if I put something out online, I never get the answer that I'm actually looking for. So having somebody who struggles with it like me is a great way to do it. I remember as a music teacher, my best instrumentalists in my band were always flute players, which I found so ironic because the flute was the hardest instrument for me to learn. And I think it all makes sense in retrospect that when you understand the struggles, you know how to ask the questions and you know how to teach it as well. So that's why I'm the missionary. I'm spreading the word of astrophotography, not a scientist, not an engineer, not an astronomer, not an expert. You can feel free to ask questions. I'll hopefully be able to answer them. But I'm going to tell you right now, for those experts out there, if I don't know something, which is very likely, I'll turn it out to the experts out there, because you'll be able to likely be able to answer them better. And while we're on that topic, experts, you're going to hear me say some things that you're probably going to disagree with. I don't want to be getting any death threats by email either. I'm choosing my language tonight very carefully for the purpose of understanding. So does pixel size matter? Yes, of course pixel size matters. But does a beginner need to understand what well depth capacity is or quantum efficiency in order to get their first Milky Way shot? No way. So my job is to demystify astrophotography for the masses. That's my mission. And it's all in an effort to avoid looking like this, which is more than one of our experiences, I'm sure. I want to tell you about this picture. This is the reason that I'm doing stuff like this. This is the reason that I created our Astro Science Center's Astrophotography Conference, because I struggled with astrophotography for a long time until a friend of mine, Gordy Duval, who is the primary astronomer at the observatory, sat down with me with his telescope and my camera, and we put it on his telescope and we started imaging. And he said, okay, well, this is not right. Here's what we need to do here. And he taught me, sitting right next to me, shooting right into a telescope, everything that I needed to do. And while I'm not going to say I didn't struggle after that, I had far more success after having someone sit right next to me. I didn't have to stay out in the middle of the night trying to search my phone for a YouTube video on why my tracking isn't working correctly or why my camera is doing one thing or another. Gordy was right there. And if it hadn't been for that, this shot would not have been possible, and the subsequent learning that I had would not be possible. So thanks, Gordy. If I had never said thanks, thanks. So we have to start with an essential question, more of a philosophical question, as what is astrophotography? And there's a number of answers to this, and I'm not expecting anyone to know what the answer, I'm not even sure I know what the answer philosophically for me is yet, but we know that it could be a form of art, right? I mean, looking at this Ansel Adams, this is no different than looking at the Helix Nebula, for example. It could be poetic. It could tell a story. And this iconic photo certainly does that. It could be scientific. It could be, searching for a supernova someplace out there night after night. So there's a variety of different questions, and ultimately the answer to that question will, as you gain experience and knowledge and equipment, will help you define your path in astrophotography. So that's an important question to ask yourself in the long run. We won't answer that tonight. The bigger question is, how do we do it? And it's not really the right question for a beginner. The real question is that, at least that I always had, is what does it look like while we're doing it? When we connect the camera to the telescope, how does that work exactly? And when we take our first image, what is it supposed to look like on the screen of the camera? How do we know if we've got the right thing? How long do we expose for? How do we know what? So it's really a matter of what does it look like while we're doing it? And that, I hope, is what we're going to see tonight, what it looks like. But the truth is, in the end, it's fundamentally the same as all photography. It involves composition, which we refer to as framing, focus, and exposure. Those three things get you an end product of a picture. Each one of them, as we escalate through the levels of complexity, will have little complexities of their own. So let's go through here. By the way, I want to mention that this is likely to spark some debate and anger also in the order in which I put these, because there's a case to be made that the easiest things could also be the most complex things. And while that's true, just again, think of it from a beginner's perspective, entering astrophotography for the very first time. And I heard somebody mention that they did a shot tonight. I think if Steve, I think it was you that mentioned you did the Orion constellation from your smartphone tonight. So that's a possibility. There's sticking a DSLR. The next level of complexity is having a DSLR on a tripod. The next level of complexity I would call putting a DSLR on top of a telescope or mounting it to a telescope. Then having a dedicated color astrophotography camera. The next level of complexity is having a monochrome dedicated astrophotography camera, maybe even cooled. This is another level of complexity. And the final level I always think of as fixing the camera on the Hubble telescope. That's the final level. And if you're at that level, please disconnect from this meeting. You have no business being here. But the truth is, for tonight's purpose, we're going to get to about this point, and if we're lucky, and if we're running on time. So let's get started. Let's start with the smartphone. The smartphone is actually a very successful confidence building tool. Like I said, I think it was Steve who had a cell phone, just took a picture of the Orion constellation tonight. But you can do a lot of things with a cell phone. In particular, they make a device specifically for taking a cell phone and mounting it to your existing telescope. And it doesn't make a difference if it's a refractor or reflector telescope. It mounts to the telescope in some way, and the little camera points right into the eyepiece, and you're good to go. This is easy to do. Visitors that come to our observatory love this. We're getting, lines of 200 people trying to look through a telescope, and some guy is there trying to, get his picture done. But it's easy. It takes only seconds to do. There's no jargon involved. It's not very expensive. So it's a great place to start. And if you haven't tried it yet, for 18 bucks, give it a whirl, see what happens. So I don't want to spend much more time than that on the smartphone concept. Let's go to the next level of complexity, the DSLR on a tripod. And this is really where the meat of things get started. So again, I want to come back to the idea that everything that we talk about early on with these early setups will also apply to more complicated setups later on. So when I talk about focus, for a DSLR and a tripod, I won't necessarily touch focus again when it's a DSLR on a telescope. It's essentially going to be the same process. So when we talk about DSLRs in particular. So there's two versions available and for a DSLR, either wide field, which requires a wide angle lens, and there's a telephoto version that requires a telephoto lens, and that you can do deep space imaging with a simple telephoto lens on your DSLR with your camera and the tripod, and that's all you may need. In the wide field area, you can do Milky Way and star trails. And I'm not saying that there's not other things to do, but those are, when you look around and you look at images done with just a DSLR and a wide angle lens on a DSLR, you're going to see it's 99 and 44/100ths Milky Way and star trails. In the telephoto version, typically it's going to be a single shot of the moon or something like that, perhaps even Saturn, or something in deep space with that telephoto lens. But I'm going to say right now that would require an extra piece called some kind of a tracking mount. I have a sky tracker that I'll show you some in depth. So those are sort of the possibilities. And we'll go through all of these right in that order right now. We'll talk about the basic functions. So the wide angle, a wide field Milky Way shot. Same concept in astrophotography as in regular photography, even film photography, framing your image, focusing, and then choosing the exposure that you want. Now, regardless of what version of photography you're doing, there's a couple of things that you can do prior to even taking your first picture. And let me go through a couple of these now. So this is my Nikon D7200, and I could say it's a Sony XT37 or a Canon 91P. It doesn't make a difference. It's a DSLR, and don't let the numbers bother you at all. So the first thing that you'll do is to set your exposure to manual. There's no point and shoot in astrophotography. So set your exposure to manual. And that will give you control over the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO setting. I recommend also using live view on the back of your camera so that you can actually see what's going on rather than looking through the viewfinder. I recommend starting with 30 seconds. And again, we're talking specifically about Milky Way here. 30 seconds for a shutter speed. And for an aperture, open it up as wide as your lens will go. This is a 16mm lens, an f2.0 lens. So that's as wide as it will go, 2.0. In the end, by the way, we're going to back that off a little bit. I don't typically want to go fully wide on that. So 30 seconds, largest aperture possible. And ISO standard garden variety 1600 is a great way to start. So those three settings on manual, that's a great way to get started. The next thing we want to do is we want to save ourselves some time out in the cold. And although noise is the primary distractor of astrophotography, you actually want to turn off the noise reduction settings on your camera. Most DSLRs have an ISO noise, high ISO noise reduction. That means, you know, like a 3200 ISO, 6400. And they also have long exposure noise reduction. Turn those off. That will save you tremendous time when you're getting started. You want to also find the setting that tells you what kind of image you're saving. There's RAW and JPEGs are the common format. Make sure that you're getting the RAW images, not just the JPEGs. You can get the RAW and the JPEG too if you want, but make sure it's always the RAW. Also set up your camera for a delayed timer, you know, the little remote that you can use, the radio remote that will trigger your shutter so that you don't have to touch the camera. The goal really in astrophotography is to touch the camera as little as possible so that you can avoid the shaking around. That will lead to good results. So anyway, there I'm taking a test shot. Let me go through that list quickly one more time. DSLR for a Milky Way on a tripod, pre-imaging session steps, and these in particular steps, many of them you can do before you even leave the house. Don't wait to get out onto the top of a mountain in 20-degree weather, trying to find your low noise or high ISO noise reduction. Do it before you leave the house. Easy enough to do. We'll get to establishing focus in a little while, but one trick that I have that many of you probably do also is I use electrical tape. Once my focus is set, I put electrical tape on the focus ring so it doesn't move. And many times I'm using manual focus there also. Sometimes autofocus if I need to find something, but generally you would turn off the autofocus also. Turning off high ISO noise reduction, turn off.
We might have a question.
Oh yeah,
Scott?
sure. Great.
Yes. One other thing that I don't think you mentioned was that you need to turn off your image stabilization if you have it.
I have that later. Thanks for that.
Oh, okay. All right.
That I show that on my telephoto lens. There's a vibration reduction and image stabilization. Yep. Thank you. Great point. Okay, high ISO noise reduction, long exposure noise reduction. Shoot in RAW, set your exposure to manual, start with 30 seconds, start with 1600 ISO, start with the largest aperture you can find, then back off a little bit. Again, these are not going to be your final settings, but it's a great place to start. Set up for a delayed remote control, use live view, and boom, take a test shot. Point your camera at the Milky Way, take a test shot and see what happens. If you don't see anything on your screen of your camera, turn the ISO up a little bit until you start to see something from 16 to 3200 to 6400 to 8000 until you actually see something, and that's when you'll make some adjustments, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. By the way, if you get all the way up to 8000 with 30 seconds and 2.0 and you're still not seeing anything, walk around and check that your lens cap is not still on your camera. I speak from experience on that. So another thing that I'd like to recommend, again, in the spirit of not touching your camera, is to use some kind of AC power. Most DSLRs have a way for you to plug them in so that you're using some external power source and not the batteries. It's very easy to let a battery run low. And even though you may have a spare battery that you can pop in there, once you've framed your shot and you've got the Milky Way where you want it, you run the risk of kind of messing things up a little bit if you have to change the battery. So I almost always use some kind of AC power. That's just me. Again, we're going to take our test shot, framing, focus, and exposure. In the Milky Way, I'm going to imagine that you can find the right path for your camera to see the Milky Way. So we won't talk too much about that, but that's I'll leave that for you. We'll talk about framing in some detail in a little bit. Focus is the big thing. We start focus by setting the focus control to infinity, but that's hardly ever exactly where it winds up being. And you look through your viewfinder, you take your test shot, and you find the screen with the picture on it, and then start zooming in until you can see the stars. And hopefully you'll zoom in enough. And once you do that, you'll see if your stars have hard edges to them, if they look round. And I can tell you, you're gonna have to deal with exposure also in focus, because at 30 seconds, your stars are probably not gonna be round, but we'll come back to that in a few minutes. First off, just zoom in, see that your stars are somewhere near focus. If you need to back off a little bit, you can do that at this point also. But there's a magic trick to finding focus. Incidentally, if I didn't mention it before, I cover the viewfinder because light can leak through there. I don't think I mentioned that, but there it is. This little magic device is called the Bahtinov mask. And if you look at it, it's a little piece of plastic that sits in front of the camera lens, and it helps you define focus, because with that grainy image that you just saw, it sometimes is really hard to see if your stars are round, or if they're in focus or not in focus. I have one of these for each lens that I use for astrophotography. They're not expensive. You know, I think the one that I just showed there is, you know, $4.99 or $9.99 or something. I have, for our 14-inch telescope, I have a great big 14-inch Bahtinov mask, and my eyes are not good enough to differentiate great focus in these environments, as these Bahtinov masks help with. And essentially, it causes a pattern on your stars. So every star in your picture will have a cross through it, diffraction spike looking thing. Did I hear a question? Okay. And when that horizontal, that third line is right through the X of the diffraction spike, that's when your focus is good. If it's to one side or above, depending on how you have your mask oriented or your camera oriented, or too far to the other side, you'll adjust your focus by taking another test shot, move your focus, test shot, move the focus, test shot, move the focus, and until you get it right in the middle. And that's the Bahtinov mask. It's a great tool. I can say that I would be lost without that when I'm out imaging. Composition, framing focus, and exposure. So here's the exposure question. And I'll be honest with you, exposure is a little bit of an elusive concept in astrophotography. And it's a little bit tricky to get it just right. And it's a little bit tricky to have somebody explain what a properly exposed picture actually is. Ask around, you'll see what I mean. But let's take our test shot. And let me show you what the Milky Way should look like. If you're taking a kind of a generic Milky Way shot with a little bit of image in the foreground, your Milky Way, and you'll find in your camera someplace what's called a histogram. And this is the distribution of light and dark across the sensor. And there's the histogram right there. Now, let me describe the histogram in a little bit more detail before we go on. Along the bottom axis is the dark to light, from left to right, dark to light. So the darkest areas of your image are on the left side. The brightest areas of your image are on the right side. And from top to bottom are the number of pixels on your sensor that captured that particular level of light. So on this histogram, effectively on this very bright area, the sensor picked up no light that was this bright. However, it picked up a lot of light that was this bright, that was this dark, essentially. And it picked up this amount of light that was this dark. And I know that sounds odd to say, the light that was dark, but that's the way I think of it. So just live with it. This histogram is specific for Milky Way. And this is generally, this big hump here is where the sky is represented. the Milky Way and stars in the Milky Way and nebulosity is all in this big hump area. And then there's a dip off right here. Then this very dark area is the foreground, those trees in the front of the picture, in front of your Milky Way. Now, one thing I want to mention that you should be attuned to as you look at histograms is that there should be a little bit of a gap. The darkest area of this histogram should always have a little gap in it. Don't ever let, when I say don't ever let, it's not like the histogram police are going to come after you. Try to avoid having the histogram appear so that it's smashed all the way up to the left side. That will just cause problems in processing, and you won't get all of your data to be truly represented. So let's look at that picture one more time. And here's the histogram pulled out of the camera, and this I brought into Camera Raw. This is that exact picture with that histogram. And here it is with the big hump here with most of the sky, a little bit of a blue tint. And here's the foreground of these trees. And notice this little campfire in here is represented there too. So now the question always comes up, well, how do you get the histogram to look one way or look the other way? And that's by establishing your exposure priorities. Again, we're talking only about exposure here, not focus, not framing, just exposure. And the goal of exposure in astrophotography is to collect a lot of photons and have enough so that when you turn the picture into an actual share of something that you want people to see, that there is something to see. And that happens by collecting a lot of photons. So, and by the way, that's the most scientific word I'm going to use tonight, photons. And there's a balance to be had here. Essentially, you want your aperture, like a bucket, wide open. Imagine photons like raindrops. If you have a small little tube and rain is falling in, you're going to collect X number of droplets. If that aperture is huge and you've got a big paint bucket, then it's going to collect more rain droplets. And that's the idea with the aperture. Wider is better in general. However, as you get too wide, there's some weird things that happen with the lens, and we won't talk about what that is, but I tend to, if a 2.0 lens is what I'm using, I'll try to get to 2.0, but typically it's going to be 2.8 or something like that. I try not to leave it wide open. Same on the other side, by the way, if I'm shooting a telephoto, something just in general, I try not to stop it all the way and close it all the way off. The other way to collect photons is to leave your shutter open. So the longer the shutter is open, the more photons, the more water will drop in that bucket, right? So if you have a cover on it, you take it off for a second, you put it back on, you'll have a certain amount of water. If you take that cover off and you leave it for an hour, the thing is going to be full. That's the general principle, is that you want as long a shutter speed as you can possibly tolerate before the worst happens, and that is the stars start to streak star trails on your image. So that's the balance. How do we get the right aperture and shutter speed to balance to make that histogram look the way we want it to look? And there's a handy dandy little formula for that. And this is the only math we'll do tonight. And it's called the 500 rule. And we use this to establish the perfect shutter speed for our Milky Way picture. And I want to clarify, when I say the perfect shutter speed, what I really mean is the longest I can leave the bucket off of the cover off the bucket before the stars start to trail. Okay, so this is, when I say ideal, it means just the longest possible shutter speed before the stars start to look like they're moving on the sky. And I can use something faster than that, but I can't use anything slower than that and expect not to get star trails. So anyway, let's talk about this formula. This is just very simple math. It's the only math we'll do tonight. So the formula reads 500 divided by the crop factor of your sensor times the focal length is your ideal shutter speed, or your slowest that you can possibly use. So let's look at my equipment, and you can plug your own equipment in here. I have a D7200, which is not a full frame camera. It has a crop factor of 1.5, which means it is not seeing the full, not a full sensor like a D, 750 or 850. And I'm using a Rokinon 16 millimeter lens. I put that f2.0 there, but the fact is for this formula, the 2.0 is irrelevant. It really doesn't make any difference because we're only talking about the focal length, the 16 millimeters, and the crop factor. So I plug those numbers in. 500 divided by 1.5 times 16 will give me my slowest possible shutter speed. 500 divided by 24, again, I'm walking through the math here, is my ideal shutter speed. And here's the answer to the question. What is the slowest shutter speed I can use on this setup on a tripod with this camera and this lens before my stars will start to trail? And the answer is 20.8 seconds. So let's look at our exposure triangle. Let's lock in the 20.8 seconds. Let's imagine that we've locked in that 2.0 for our aperture. That's the opening that'll let the photons in. The only thing left really here is the ISO. Now, we haven't really talked about that yet, but ISO will allow us to manipulate one way or the other how fast we can emulate on our camera sensor. I don't want to get into more than that, but a higher ISO will allow you to do certain things with your aperture or your shutter speed than a lower ISO will. So let's go back to our histogram and let's see if we can accomplish that with settings. And again, it's a balance. So here's the histogram. Here's the histogram from that shot. And let's look at my final choices here. I could use up to 20.8 seconds. I wound up using 8 seconds. That's an 8-second manual exposure. I wound up sticking at the f2 for whatever reason. I don't remember why. Again, keep in mind, these are a couple of years old already. And I wound up at 6400. I deviated from my 1600. I went from 20 or 30 seconds, which is where I started, to 8 seconds. And I balanced my ISO and my shutter speed so that I did not have to go above the 20.8 seconds. And I still got a relatively good looking histogram. Not perfect, but it's pretty good. And this is what it kind of looked like. It's the setting from the camera. 8 seconds, f2, ISO 6400, 16 millimeter lens. This is the result of that. And you saw the histogram. The histogram that proved it. So this is a single shot. It's raw, which is good, but is one shot of the Milky Way enough? And the answer is yes. However, it doesn't have to be, and it probably isn't. And I'll tell you why. Every shot you take has elements built into it, into your camera, that work against using the full power of the image. And we can maximize our camera and our settings and so forth by using two processes, one called stacking and one called calibration. And this is all about reducing the noise of your camera sensor and correcting for things that go on in your lens. But so let's start a little bit backwards. Let's start with stacking. For every one picture you take, you call it a light frame. So when you hear somebody refer to light frames, they're talking about the actual image itself. If you take 20 of these light frames, you'll have sub-light frames or subframes. So when somebody says, how many frames did I take? You can say, I took 20 subs. That's kind of the language. What stacking does is it takes each image. If I took, in this case, I'm going to say 11 of these shots, it takes it and imagine a transparency of a shot and then another transparency of a shot, just like the old days. You remember that transparency projector? And you layer these on top of each other so that you have a stack, in this case, of 11 images of this Milky Way shot. And what it's going to do is look down, it's going to turn it, and it's going to look through each pixel. It's going to start in one spot, and it's going to look at that first pixel, and it's going to say, let me look at each of those transparents, each of those images, and see if there's consistency here or if there's inconsistency here. And it's going to compare them. And it will determine if it's part of your image, it will say, okay, I'm going to leave this alone. If it's not part of your image, it's going to neutralize it. And then it's going to move to the next pixel. It's going to look at all 11, and it's going to compare them and say, is there discrepancies here, or is it part of the image? And it's going to neutralize it if it's not. If it is, it's going to leave it alone, essentially speaking. So, and it's going to do that across all 11 shots on every pixel. It's going to do an evaluation. And that's what stacking is. And by taking those areas that it determines to be inconsistent, it creates a more neutral background without the noise. And it's all about noise because those inconsistencies in each of those layers are caused by noise in the camera in some way or another. So stacking reduces noise. That's the tale of the story. However, we have a little bit of a problem with the Milky Way. And let me show you these 11 shots. I'm not sure if you can see this clearly on your screen. I've got this on a loop, but what you're seeing, or what I hope you see, is that the Milky Way over these 8-second shots, 11 8-second shots, is actually moving, right? We know that the Earth is spinning. The Milky Way is going to appear to move across the sky. So it's in the stacking process, fine for the background, because the foreground, the trees are not moving, right? Even this little branch up here is not moving. However, the Milky Way is moving across the sky. So how are we going to achieve that stacking concept if each image is shifted a little bit? And it's not even the whole image, just part of the image. Well, we do that in specialized software. And even though I said I wasn't going to talk much about processing, I thought I've got to show you this software, because in about a minute and a half, you'll take those 11 shots and stack them to one shot that looks like it's without noise altogether. So let me walk through that software. It's called Starry Landscape Stacker. That's what I use. There's 100 of these types of software. And all you do is you load your 11 pictures in, and it does an evaluation of each of those 11. And I'm actually going to fast forward for the sake of time here a little bit. It's evaluating them, and it will give you a little bit of a display there and show you what it's found. Here are my 11 light frames. I want you to notice here that there's dark and flat also. We're going to come back to those in a little while if we have time, but it's really the light frames. I'm only taking 11 of those actual images of the that I used, not darks or flats at the moment. Let me continue on. And again, this is real time. I've loaded those 11 images. I don't have a particularly fast computer, but what it did was it found the sky in those 11 images and it displayed it on the screen. And I could tell this is 11 because you can see here that these stars are streaked. So it took the 8-second images, put them 11 side by side, and shows me what the sky is. And with those little red dots, it asks me, am I sure this is the sky? And I will add a couple of dots there just for fun by clicking on it. And then I'll say, yeah, I think that's pretty much the sky. Now I say, find the sky. It returns with this fantastic thing. Is this the sky? And yeah, that's the sky. So now automatically it takes those 11 images, extracts the sky out of them, aligns them together, does the noise evaluation, fixes it, and then puts it back on the foreground. And that's what it looks like. So in less than a minute and a half, you have a stacked Milky Way galaxy picture that looks actually pretty good, right? That's satisfactory for sure, especially if you're just starting. Let me take you to another view where I've exaggerated the noise, because this is really what I want to show you here. I'm going to go picture by picture and show you the noise patterns. You can see that every image has its own noise pattern to it. And that's how the software knows, as it's looking through those stacked layers, what's different and what's the same. And effectively, it neutralizes the things that are different. It removes the noise and it neutralizes the noise. And you wind up with this. And this looks, pretty clean. So if I take that image, I have a pretty good place to start. And, again, I'm not going to get into the processing, but that's the pre-processing of it. Once I get into the more complicated end of things, then, we'd have to talk more processing. But effectively, because I used RAW and not just JPEG, I can turn this image into that image. And you see, it took about 1.5 minutes to do the stacking of it. Gave me that. I want to say, I think I wasn't using anything fancy at the time. I think I used like Adobe Lightroom or something in order to make that look this way. So that's essentially the framing, the focus, and the exposure of the Milky Way, with a little bit of stacking built in there also. So that's kind of where we're at. So that's Milky Way. The next great thing are star trails. I want to go through this very quickly because, I don't want everybody to be here until 2 o'clock in the morning. And if you know me, I could be here till 2 o'clock in the morning. But a pretty junky looking star trails picture looks like this, right? I'm pointed at Polaris. I have some foreground here, which I don't need, but, and the stars trail across the sky. These could be an individual, 4-hour exposure, but that's not what actually happened. These were individual 297.9 second exposures. And I'm sure what I did here is I said, let's go 5 minutes, take a 5-minute exposure. And it wound up going to 297.9. This is exactly the same camera as I used in the Milky Way shot. It's on that same exact tripod with that same exact lens. So I just moved it inside our roll-off roof observatory, and I looked up at Polaris, and I said, okay, let's start with 5 seconds. And that's what the histogram looks like. Notice it's a little different than the histogram for a Milky Way because I don't have the foreground of those dark trees in this one. I do have some much lighter areas now. Oh, you can see my mouse, yeah. I do have some lighter areas in the histogram, but again, most of it is in this rich middle lower third section. It looks like I took 40 5-minute exposures. And let me show you what that looks like in actual time. These are the individual 5-minute exposures. And in the end, some specialized software that you can find to download, most likely for free. I'm going to say that this was called, Starry Trail Stacker instead of Starry Landscape Stacker. But it effectively does exactly the same thing. I take all of those pictures and I compress them together into one final picture. And you can see here, early in my career with star trails, there were probably a couple of images that I didn't like. Let me see if I can find it just for fun.
I have a question, if I may.
Yeah, please.
My camera only goes up to 30 seconds. How do you get a 5-minute exposure? You need a special camera for that?
Excellent question. I'm going to answer that in a few minutes when we talk about using laptop control software. So that's the answer to that question. If your camera only goes up to 30 seconds, you are stuck at 30 seconds unless somebody knows a way that I don't, to use an intervalometer or your camera connected to a laptop that controls the shutter.
Right, there's a bulb setting, but I don't want to keep pushing the button down for 5 minutes.
But you, okay, so that's a good point. There, on some cameras, well, on most cameras, you can get a little remote that you press once to open the shutter, and you have a little stopwatch. And after 5 minutes, you press it again, and the shutter closes. Then you press it again, start the stopwatch over and over again. You're right to not want to press the button on the camera because that introduces shake that you want to avoid at all costs. But an intervalometer is the way to do that. And that either plugs into the USB port on the camera or some other port, or some remote control software. And I'll show you what that remote control software looks like in a little bit.
And I'll just say too, there are some cameras, even though they're DSLRs, if they were low-end models or maybe a couple years old, that really just did not have a way, even, they didn't have a bulb mode and did not have an intervalometer setting. So the only option for that then, like particularly if you had a bulb mode, but not any kind of software capability to talk with it or an intervalometer port, the only way to do it then is to have a mechanical remote switch. It's a wire that can be locked in place that literally just pushes a little pin down on top of your trigger so that it can do the holding for you.
Great, sounds risky. Okay, so that's the answer to that. Getting 5 minutes, you're right, though, is sometimes a little tricky on a DSLR, especially if it wants to argue with you. DSLRs also often have intervalometers built in the setting someplace. You just search for it, or you can buy an external intervalometer. Again, press of a button, and it looks like, remember the old cable release buttons on film cameras? I remember using those a lot early on. So that's the star trail story. We've had the Milky Way and the star trail story. We've talked a little bit about exposure and the histogram, focusing and exposure and so forth. So that's kind of the story there. In the telephoto world, I want to go very quickly through the single shot version of these. And this is where I think, Steve, it was probably you that talked about turning off a couple of settings. On your lens, on a telephoto lens in particular, you probably have a vibration reduction setting. That's on the side, it's a little switch. It's a good idea to turn that off, as well as any setting inside your camera that might try to correct for movement. So that's a little something that even on a wide area, a wide angle lens, you might want to find those settings and turn those off. In particular with telephoto lenses, they can be particularly annoying, only because they fight the image that you're trying to take. I don't want to get too much more into it than that, but in any event, the single shot, and Steve, I don't know if it was you, was there anything more to say about that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Anyway, with a single shot of the moon, again, this is a telephoto lens on my camera on a tripod. That's all this is. And this is a shot, from several years ago, probably out of my back porch. And it's pretty impressive for a first attempt at this. And I didn't do anything fancy on this. I don't even have a data card on it. It was literally just taking an experimental shot with, probably thought like a half a second would be great, with a ISO of 1600. And what I probably got was just a big fat white disc on the screen. So you'll realize pretty soon that the moon is, as you know, super bright. So you actually need to treat it like almost like daylight, and your exposure winds up being very, very short. So anyway, again, not too much on this. I want to kind of spend time on some more important things. So let me move on in that case. And that is deep space with a DSLR on a tripod. This is the most satisfying of them, for me at least at this point, even though I've done some other more complicated stuff. When I feel like I need to cleanse my soul, I go back to putting my camera on a sky tracker, and I'll show you what that is in a few minutes, and taking some deep space stuff. It's just super simple and fun, and I don't have to think about a whole heck of a lot. Just in case you didn't know, the Earth spins on its axis, and that bothers us as photographers of deep space images, because our camera is swinging around the Earth, and we need to compensate for that. So while we're on the Earth and we're spinning around, we're kind of looking at this, massive sky movement, and we're bothered by that sky movement. Hopefully it's not moving that fast. But what that does to our exposures is basically this effect. If I'm sitting on the Earth and I'm spinning around, anything on the Earth that I take an exposure of looks pretty good in terms of blurring. However, anything off of the Earth as we're spinning around gets blurred almost instantaneously, especially in deep space. So imagine, if you will, you're driving in a car. A great way to imagine this is driving in a car and look out the passenger side window. And don't be the driver, by the way, be a passenger in the car. Look out the passenger side window and take a look at the horizon, at the trees along, if you're next to a field, look at the trees, and you can see that they're kind of moving at a particular rate, moving past your field of view. Then take out a pair of binoculars and look at the same area. And what you're going to see is those trees zipping by your view at that point. That's effectively the same thing. And we can't have that in astrophotography. We can't have that at all. So we need a way to compensate for the rotation of the Earth and basically stop the sky in its tracks. And we use what's called a tracking mount for that. And there's an escalating level of complexity to tracking mounts. This is a very simple version, not the simplest of versions, but you can see a telescope mounted with a DSLR and the tracking mount worked out so that it's compensating for the spin of the Earth and tracking the Orion constellation up here, probably looking at the Orion Nebula, if I'm guessing correctly. And it's compensating for the rotation of the Earth. So that's good. That's what we want to do. We don't want to let things get out of control. So tracking becomes important once you start doing deep space imaging, whether it's with a DSLR or a telescope and a camera. And tracking really, in the most basic sense, is a blind system to compensate for the Earth's rotation. It has to be aligned with the axis of the Earth, and it spins counter to the Earth's rotation. So whatever's on that mount is tracking the sky in perfect time. And I say blind because a tracking mount, once you turn it on, it's going to start spinning. It doesn't care if there's a camera attached to it. It doesn't care if the mount is right or not. It's going to start moving. So we need to make sure that it's aligned with the rotation of the Earth. There's another step to that. The older brother, not the older brother, but the bigger brother of tracking is called guiding, and that's much more precise, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. But this is what a sky tracker looks like. This is a specialized device that's on your tripod, and your camera sits on top of that. So it's in between your tripod and the camera. And it's as simple as that. I won't say anymore. That's what it looks like. But the trick is that we have to align it with the center of the Earth, the axis of the Earth. And we do that by first adjusting our altitude with the little dial on the side of it. And you'd have to know what your altitude, or not altitude, your latitude is. In my case, we're at 44 up here in Tupper Lake. You guys might be at 42. I'm not sure what you are down there, but basically it has to be at the right angle, and it has to be level, which is what that little bubble is for. And it has to generally be pointed north towards Polaris, which is the star we use for alignment. And once that's done, I can put the sky tracker on and lock it in. And I'll use this little eyepiece here on the side, and that will help me get it aligned with the axis of the Earth by using Polaris as a guide. When you look through that eyepiece, you see something that looks like this. And imagine that the blue is the dark sky. This reticle, as it's termed, is illuminated. It's a bright red reticle inside there, and that's what it looks like when you're there. And you have to place Polaris on one of those circles somehow. But how do you know where it is? Well, luckily, Ioptron publishes a piece of software that goes with this mount, and it tells you where Polaris is supposed to be. It automatically knows what time of day it is, what your latitude is, what your elevation is. It'll even tell you the temperature. But most importantly, it'll tell you where Polaris is supposed to be. And it does that visually with this little green plus sign. And that will move over the course of the night. So as it gets later into the night, that will rotate around the circle and tomorrow at 9:00 p.m., it'll wind up in exactly the same spot. So when you first look through that reticle, hopefully you'll see Polaris in there someplace. And notice I use this to demonstrate. Let's imagine that that's Polaris. It could wind up that it's up here somewhere, or wherever. It may not be. It's not going to be right on that green box, that's for sure. So what you do at that point is you look back and forth in your reticle and you adjust the mount's screws, the azimuth and the altitude, by moving them back and forth and adjusting your altitude to get it precise. And by looking back and forth and making minor adjustments, you will eventually get Polaris onto that dot. It may take a little bit of a journey and maybe several shots until you get it just right. But by going back and forth, you'll eventually get it. Once Polaris is on that dot, you are polar aligned. Your axis of rotation mimics that of the Earth, and you have now compensated for the spin of the Earth. I find it a good practice to go back to the reticle often and make sure that it hasn't taken me an hour and a half to do, and that little green plus sign is still in the same place that it was, because once it moves, you've got to do another adjustment. But once you get it for the first time, you're good to go. Check my reticle again, and good to go. So now I can put my camera on. Again, the mount sits between your tripod and your camera. I take exactly the same camera with exactly that same telephoto lens, and I tighten it on. And now that I know that the mount is aligned, it doesn't matter which direction my camera is pointing in. I will point it to anything in the sky that I want, because it's going to spin and the mount is going to take care of compensating for the rotation of the Earth. So I can move it around as I see fit. I can point it at the ground if I want. In our case tonight, for our purposes, I'm going to point it at the North American Nebula, and we're going to do some shots of that. So there we go. I find it handy to make sure that I look at the reticle again, because sometimes mounting the camera causes Polaris to move, and I have to simply put it back where it came from. So now that the camera's on there, it's time to take our test shot, and we start by framing, then focus and exposure. Framing in deep space is a little bit more difficult than the Milky Way, especially if, well, not especially, because you're using a telephoto lens, your field of view is very, very narrow. So you may think you're getting a particular spot in the sky, and your view is actually pretty wonky. I created a little device that I'm happy to share with you, and that is just a little clamp for my workshop, screwed into a screwing device that connects to the hot shoe of my camera, and I stick a laser pointer in there. So now wherever my camera is pointed, or wherever that laser is pointed, that's what my camera is going to take a picture of. And in this case, I'm pointed there, nowhere near the North American Nebula. What I'd have to do, of course, for those of you who know the sky, I have to find Deneb, and then I have to go a little bit south of that, right? That's how I would know. And I would take a test shot, see that Deneb, that it's there, move a little bit, see if I've got something there, and keep moving until I'm actually in the right place. Back to focus again, I'm going to use exactly the same method as I did before. I'm going to zoom into a star with a batten-off mask on, and I'm going to check out the pattern of my star. If I have that little cross and the line perfectly through it, then I am dead on, which is pretty happy. However, I find it much better and easier to do things like focus and exposure with a camera control device, like Backyard EOS or Backyard Nikon. These are pieces of software that when you connect your camera to your laptop via USB, it allows you to control all of the features of your camera without touching the camera. And it's particularly important here because any slight movement you make is going to change your field of view a little bit, and you don't want to get too far off. So what it looks like is just as simple as this. Your USB is connected to the camera in the laptop. You click on the connect. This is Nikon backyard Nikon. Again, there's all sorts of camera control software out there. Backyard EOS for Canon, but I like this piece of software. And then I click on the frame and focus. It brings up a view looking right through my lens. And you can see sort of an exaggerated view on this side here, which I'll use in a second. But I find a star that I want to focus on, that I want to get focus on, I guess is the right way to say that. And once I do, I can start to move my focus. And you can do that through this software also, until the star gets as small as possible. And that's really the trick, is to make it as small as humanly possible. And it even comes with a kind of a digital version of a Bahtinov mask here. But you can have your own Bahtinov mask right on your viewfinder, on your lens, and see the spike pattern right in this view here. Sometimes I use this just for fun, this digital version. You see the yellow is the X and the red is the line that would go through them. But there's another number here that all of this software would help you achieve focus, called FWHM, or full width half maximum. You don't need to know what that means exactly. It's a mathematical calculation, but that number will tell you when your star is at its smallest point. Right now I'm at 16 or so. I adjust my focus. Let me adjust it faster. Here I'm at 8, 7.9, 7.8. That looks pretty good. And I want that FWHM to be as low as possible. And once I get it to the lowest point possible, I know that I'm in focus. So that's how I focus with the camera control software. Exposure. Let's go back to our exposure triangle. We still have the ISO, aperture, and shutter speed to deal with. But as my friend TJ Connolly said to me, I don't think he said these exact words, but I asked him, I'm always asking about exposure. And essentially what he said to me is, almost like a Zen, philosopher, look to the histogram. That's sort of what his advice is. Always seek the histogram, Seth, seek the histogram. So that's really the point here. A deep space image is going to look a little bit different than a histogram for Milky Way, in that you're going to get generally a bulge towards the left here. As I mentioned earlier, you want to leave a space along the left so you're not smashed all the way up along the left-hand side. And you'll hardly have anything in here at all. Some of this lightest stuff you'll see will be stars. And this is the way a deep space histogram will typically look. So as you're taking your images, as you're experimenting with exposure, and we won't go through that whole process again, but as you're adjusting your ISO or your aperture, or your, well, probably not your aperture, but your shutter speed, you'll want to keep your eye on this histogram. Just keep coming back to this until it looks like this. Okay, so here's the ugliest picture of my early career. This is the North American Nebula. If you can find it, I will send you $1,000. And there's a reason it looks this bad. Many of you experienced astrophotographers probably know immediately what went wrong in this picture, or where I went wrong in this picture, literally where I went wrong. But the fact is that this picture right out of the camera looked like this. In the back of on my little screen there, on my live view, or as it displayed, the histogram, it looked like this, very dark. In deep space images, when you take that first photo, that light frame, you will rarely see the image. You rarely see your subject in there. It'll be dark. And in my case, it looked like that. My final exposure was, 90 seconds effectively. 90 seconds, 800 ISO, 110 millimeters, f5. And my histogram didn't look terrible, but this is what it looked like. It kind of looked like it was supposed to look, right? Here's the main part of it. There's not that little space in here, which I wish there was. And there's a lot of junk up here. And the reason there's a lot of junk up here is because you can see a lot of stars up there. And we don't want to see stars there. We want to see less in this histogram of the stars. If the stars ended right about here when you're shooting, that would be great. You would barely see any stars here, but you'd have all of the data that you'll need to process them later on. So that's the way the histogram for a deep space object looks. And here's that image. I don't know if anybody wants to unmute their mic and take a stab at what they think went wrong on this imaging session. I'd be glad to enter. We don't have any door, I don't have any door prizes, but if anybody want to take a guess, I'll give it a couple of seconds.
Looks like you had some clipping maybe.
Oh, I wish it was that simple. No, I wish it was that complex is what I should say.
Any filtering issues?
Could be. This is just my DSLR on a tripod. Same one I did hundreds of other pictures.
A sudden flock of moths.
That would have been biblical, but no, that wasn't it. I did this shot outside the observatory, right underneath a security camera.
Oh.
And that infrared just flooded into this picture. So it's essentially worthless. And I'll find another time to do the North American Nebula sometime in my future. But these are the early mistakes that you make. You don't know it while you're out there. You think it looks okay. Here's that image. It looks kind of like other deep space images that I've taken. It's dark. I can't really see anything out there. But now I will know to avoid the security cameras. In fact, at the roll-off now, any imaging that we do, I disable all of the security cameras. So, by the way, that's a great time to rob us if you're ever thinking about it. I can do some imaging and you can come in and nobody would ever know it. Okay, let's go back to this stacking idea. That has been true all the way through, by the way, from the Milky Way all the way through deep space. The more pictures, the more images you have, the more your software will be able to eliminate in processing the noise associated with it. But remember earlier we said to turn off, or I said, I don't know if anybody else said otherwise, to turn off long exposure noise reduction and high ISO noise reduction. There's a reason for that. It's a lot cheaper to do it later on than it is, and less time consuming to do it when you're at home. If you do it if you leave those things on, your imaging session will literally be twice as long with the same results. You won't have any more images, but you'll be there for twice as long. Rather than that, we take a series of images in addition to our light frames, our image frames, and we use them in processing later on. They're called calibration files or calibration frames. And there are three main kinds that we use. The flat frames are basically just I'll show you what they look like, but they help remove things like dust and lens vignetting, and you'll see what that looks like in a few minutes. Another type of calibration frame that helps with noise is called a dark frame. This is taken at exactly the same exposure, ISO, et cetera, as your light frame. So if I took a 30-second image with my, to take my deep space, then I need a 30-second dark frame to match that, or multiple 30 seconds. And this comes from thermal noise in your image sensor, and it's magnified by temperature, exposure time, and ISO, and probably other things also. But we turn them off in the camera so that we can remove them in processing. And the last kind is a little elusive. It's called a bias frame. And inherently, the sensor of your camera has a certain level of electronic vibration in it, if you will. Read noise is what it's called. And by taking bias frames, you can neutralize the effect of that electronic vibration. It's not really vibration. I'm using that as just a term. But these frames are taken after your light frames are done, usually at about 2 o'clock in the morning. So be prepared to be out late to do these. Something I should mention about the flat frames is those should be done first, because those have to be done at exactly the same setting with your lens, the same focus. You can't move the focus, the zoom, don't move anything to take your flat frames. They have to be exactly, the optical train has to be exactly as it was when you were taking your your light frames or your image frames. And I just want to go through very quickly and show you how I do these. There's a million ways to do it. I have a little piece of translucent plexiglass I put in front of one of my photographic white boxes. I don't touch any of the, any of the things on the camera, leave the optical train exactly as it is. And I set the camera to AV mode. And I do that in my camera control software. And I'm going to zoom through this a little bit so that we get to the end. That's what a flat frame looks like. It's just this simple neutral grayish looking thing that we use to subtract out the yuckiness in our optical train. And luckily, I know my equipment well enough to know that this dust bunny is on my lens. This has been there for years, and at some point I should clean that. But so that would show up in my final picture if I didn't remove it. So I remove it by using these flat frames. You can also see there's some vignetting here and so forth. So that's what the flat frame looks like. And you take it by with this. Some people put their camera, I'll just go back to that screen for a second. Some people just take their camera, the whole thing, and put it onto an iPad with a white screen on it and do their light or their flat frames that way. There's actual flat boxes that they're called, and those are used for taking flat frames also. There's a million ways to do it. This is the way I do it for this particular camera. Let's go to the dark frames and the bias frames. They sound exactly like they are. They're dark. So you want to remove the lens and put your lens cap on your body. You could actually put the lens cap right over your lens also, but I use the body cap for that purpose. And the dark frame is taken exactly the same way in the camera control software. And I'm going to zoom ahead to that as well. So there looks like a dark frame right there. And it looks dark because it is. All you're really capturing is the noise. And let me move ahead to the bias frame. Miraculously, the bias frame looks exactly the same. It looks black because what you can't see in there is the noise that's inherent in that image. So I'm going to take 50 of these, and I'm going to take 50 dark frames, and I'm going to take 50 flat frames to match my my image that I took of 50 light frames, I guess I took in the end. That's not a real number, by the way. I may take 300 light frames of the Andromeda galaxy, and I might wind up taking 50 flat frames and maybe 30 dark and bias frames. So that's not a real number. I'm just using that for tonight's purpose. There's no real rule about that. There is a place where taking more doesn't do anything for you. It doesn't take more noise out. It just adds time to your process. So that's the capture process with the DSLR on top of a tripod while tracking. And that's the difference in this with the telephoto lens, is it's while tracking. Let's go to our escalating level. We did the smartphone, we did the DSLR on the tripod, and we did it with tracking also with the zoom lens. Now we're on to the DSLR on a telescope. And this is my favorite thing, because this is something that I just sat and wondered about for so long. How do you do that exactly? How do you get a DSLR on a telescope? And I guess in the end, it's as simple as thinking of the telescope as the primary lens. You take your lens off and you put the telescope on as the lens for your DSLR. And that's really, it just is as simple as that. The principles of tracking become more critical, following the movement of the sky, because you're now at a 600 millimeter focal length instead of a 300 millimeter, or you could be at a 1200 millimeter focal length. So the sky is going to zip through your field of view even faster unless you track. The principles of framing, focus, and exposure still apply. You want to get your image into your object into your field of view. If you have a tracking mount, a go-to mount, this is as simple as doing the go-to with the telescope, just like you would with an eyepiece. Focus and exposure, just as we've talked about already. Calibration frames are even more critical now, because your exposures are going to be that much longer if you want to get those really deep space objects. So this is what it looks like. This was a puzzle to me. I never really got this. But in order to attach your DSLR, you get this little T-ring adapter. And this is one for Nikon. There's one for Sony cameras. There's one for Canon cameras, because the way the lens attaches is a little different on each of them. So I take off the body cap. And instead of putting on a lens, I put on this T-mount adapter. And it snaps in just like, it feels just like the lens would. And it kind of looks like a little lens too. So now instead of putting an eyepiece on the telescope, I'm simply going to take out the whatever lens or whatever's in there, and I'm going to slide the DSLR and the T-ring adapter onto the telescope. And that's it. I can't tell you how long I was puzzled by this, not having done it, only doing wide field. I was a little bit afraid of trying to venture into the world of using a telescope with my camera because I couldn't really think of how do you attach it. So because we're talking about such long focal lengths at this point, tracking is really not enough anymore. If we think of this as the blind tracking of the Earth's rotation, we need something with a lot more power to it. And that's called guiding. So tracking is blind, but guiding is a pixel by pixel correction based on a single star as it moves across the field of view of an additional telescope and additional camera mounted onto your main telescope. And let me show you what that looks like on a larger telescope. We'll get back to our DSLR in a minute. But here's a Celestron HD Edge. This is a 1400. This is our main telescope. And here's my main camera. Here's our tracking mount that does the tracking across the sky to compensate. The blind version, it doesn't know if it's right or not. It doesn't care. It can't see the sky. It doesn't know anything about the sky. But on top of it, I've mounted an additional telescope and I've plugged an additional camera into that additional telescope. So I've got my regular finder scope, but I can't really use that for this purpose. So the guiding telescope and the guiding camera get mounted right on top of your main telescope and camera. Let's go back for a minute to our setup that we were talking about. Again, this is the same DSLR, it's the D7200, and it's mounted onto a telescope at our observatory. This is a TeleVue 101. It's a 540 millimeter focal length, 5.4 speed, so it's an f5.4, and that's going to come in handy in a few minutes. But let me show you what it looks like. The DSLR is attached with that T-ring, just as I mentioned. And there's the telescope. And on top of the telescope, I've got this very common guide scope. This is the Orion 50 millimeter guide scope. There's about 1 million of these in operation all over the world, or maybe more. And plugged into that Orion guide scope is its little companion camera. This is an additional camera. This is the Starshoot auto guider made by Orion also. And it has a USB port on it. And that's the setup. It's an additional telescope, small telescope, and additional camera in addition to the DSLR for guiding purposes. And there's the mount. It's just a tracking go-to mount on a pier in this case instead of a tripod, but the concept is exactly the same. And here's what it looks like all connected. You can see the DSLR has the connection to power. It has the USB connection to the laptop. The mount for the Ioptron is connected to USB on the laptop, and the guide camera is connected to USB on the laptop. And there's just a different view of exactly the same thing, all connected to the laptop. The laptop is the main ambassador between the guide scope camera and the mount. So in guiding, you need that laptop to translate the movement of that star across the field of view of that guide camera and tell the mount to do something. And here's what it looks like when you get it connected. This is a software package called PhD. I think it stands for press here dummy, but it hardly ever works out that way. It's a little bit more complicated than it seems. But again, in the spirit of this is what it looks like when you do it, this is what guiding looks like. It finds a star, it locks onto that star like a target, and then it measures the movement of the star and tells your mount, your tracking mount, to make corrections based on how much that star has moved in that telescope or in that guide camera. Shows you a nice little picture of the star, but again, it's locked on there. To launch it, here's a laptop with the guide camera connected. I launch PhD. I say I want to connect to A, my guide camera, which I do, and B, my mount. I need both because the guide camera is going to collect information, but it's going to send information to my mount also and tell it that it needs to move. So this is what it looks like in the real world of astrophotography. And again, once you tell it to start guiding, it locks onto a star and it sends messages back and forth to the mount so that it makes those corrections.
Seth, we got a quick question about
Yeah.
that. This is seen videos of guiding done by sending images from the DSLR over to the computer and having the computer do the guiding. Is it more accurate than having an extra guiding scope, or is it a matter of preference?
Boy, that's a great question. I've never heard of that before, frankly, because it doesn't feel like it would get there and to the mount fast enough. But if people are doing it, I suppose it's an option. Is anybody out there with some significant experience know about that?
Yeah, it has
Go ahead.
a problem. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say, normally you wouldn't use your primary imaging camera for your guiding because your imaging camera is going to be doing extended exposures, and your guiding camera needs to be doing an exposure every second or two to keep track of the star.
Yes.
So you'll usually have to have a second camera. Now there is a very expensive type of camera that can basically split the inbound signal of light into two different cameras all within one unit. But it's not a DSLR. It's a higher complexity type of device and not very common because it's expensive.
That's a great point, though, Steve. In splitting the image, I should mention that there is a method in which you have what's called an off-axis guider, and it connects to the same train and uses the same telescope. So you don't need an additional telescope. It looks into the same image as your DSLR, or it's looking through the telescope just the way your DSLR would be. But as the light comes in, a small mirror redirects some of the light on a 90-degree angle into this additional camera, which is the guide camera, and it's called off-axis guiding. It's not what you were talking about, but that's the only thing I could think of that would be suitable. Yikes.
Did you have anything to add to that, Greg? Or was that what you were going to say?
No, that type of guiding used to be done a long time ago. It's called track and accumulate. You would take an exposure just long enough not to cause any streaking in your photo. But over a period of time, you'd take 10 photos or so, and you want to move the telescope just a little bit between each photo so you don't lose the object. And I don't think anybody does that anymore.
Okay, well, it's good to know. Interesting. So in addition to the PhD software or some other guiding software, and there are other things out there, but PhD, again, I'm guessing is loaded on everyone's computer in this group that does astrophotography. But in addition to that, we still have our camera control software. The camera control software and PhD can be related, but they are completely independent. For our purposes tonight, they are completely independent. So you could technically run your camera control software off of another laptop altogether, and PhD connected to your camera, your guide camera, and your mount on another computer. They don't need to be on the same computer. Again, I'm going to qualify that by saying there are applications where they do work together. So take that with a grain of salt and don't send me any nasty email because that's not entirely true. Let's go back to our histogram and our target for this section. Again, histogram for deep space looks typically along these lines. Again, look to make sure there's a little bit of space on the left here and very little up on this area. If the bulk of your deep space object is all the way up here, you've got a light on someplace in your field of view. Going back to our exposure triangle, one thing that changes in using a telescope and a camera is that your aperture is no longer available. Even if you wanted to open up your aperture even more or close it, you don't have that option anymore. Remember, I said we were using the Nikon, Teleview NP101, a 540 millimeter focal length f5.4. That's not going to change. That telescope is f5.4, so that doesn't make a difference. My only options now are ISO and shutter speed. That's just one of those little fine points. The ISO is variable. The shutter speed, however, sky's the limit. If your guiding is perfect, you could theoretically guide all night long and leave your shutter open all night long and not have a single star trail in your image. I don't know about anybody else, but that has never happened with me. I can get 20-minute exposures if I really want to. There's not really a need to do that, but I could do that if I wanted, if my guiding was just right. But that's the whole idea, is that with the guiding, your telescope and the object in the sky are so perfectly aligned that there's virtually no movement of the stars. So you could just leave it open and let those photons just fall right in. It's a beautiful concept, isn't it? Photons falling in. Light frames. That's our composition and our focus. We did 100, and I think I was looking at Andromeda in this case, 100 exposures at 60 seconds. My calibration frames, I did 50 of them for flats at 1/1250th of a second exposure. Remember, I set that to AV. The dark, since they were 60-second light frames, they were 60-second dark frames also. With my bias frames, I wanted essentially no exposure. If I could have a 0 exposure, I would do that, but I have to do something. So I use the fastest possible shutter speed, 1/8000th of a second, and that's going to reveal some of that yuckiness in the sensor that I'm getting. So let's just take a quick look at, well, you know what, for the sake of time, we don't need to look at those. We saw what dark frames were, we saw what light frames were. What I do want to show you is what it looks like when you're post-processing, because this is the scary part that a lot of people are put off by. Let's say I take all of these light frames. Let's say I take 50 flats, 50 darks, 50 bias frames, and what happens then? How do I stack them all together? What do I do? I know there's Starry landscape stacker, but how do I get those frames into a single image that I can take into Photoshop or Lightroom? And again, we're not talking about Milky Way here. We're talking about deep space objects, and calibrate all of that so that the noise is gone, the imperfections in my optical train are gone, and I've maximized all of the photons that I've spent the whole night collecting, or multiple nights collecting. Well, there's a great little piece of software called Deep Sky Stacker, and it's free. And it's easy to use, as easy as Starry Landscape Stacker. And I want to show you, again, in just about in real time, what it looks like loading these files. The processing takes a few minutes, but the loading happens pretty quickly. Oops, let me go back and start that again. My first step is to, come on. Where am I? Okay. Okay, first step is to just navigate and find your files. This is all of the dark frames, all of the light frames, flats, bias frames. I load them all in, boom, there they are. There's a dark frame. I can see them all there. And here's a light frame of Andromeda. And there it looks like not much, right? It's very, very dark, and you have to kind of get comfortable with that. Well, with the default settings in Deep Sky Stacker, I can, in just a few minutes, go through and make a couple of clicks and wind up with a final image that I'm ready to take into Photoshop or Lightroom or PixInsight in that case. And here's what it looks like in the end. This is the final, what is saved as an auto-saved file. You see that there's a generally kind of a flat looking histogram here, a very dark picture, but I don't care because I'm going to take that someplace and I'm going to do something with it. But this image now has all of that noise removed from it. It has all of the imperfections in the optical train removed from it. That little dust bunny that was on my image sensor someplace over here is gone. I don't need to worry about that anymore. And all I did was load these files in, press the default settings, and let it go. This image is saved, and I take it into whatever image processing software I happen to be using. I use PixInsight a lot now, but don't be bothered by that. When I started, it was pretty much Lightroom or Photoshop or an early version of Photoshop, I think. I had an old computer. I think I was using like Photoshop 4 or 3 or something. So when it comes right into your imaging software, it looks dark. It looks like there's nothing there. And that's how it should look. So don't be put off by that. With a little bit of work, you get it to start to look like something. And with a little bit more work, it looks even better. Again, this is early in the career of astrophotography. It doesn't take a lot to get to this point, really. And I did it. So again, if I can do it, I feel like anybody should be able to do this and not be turned off by, how do I get these files to look like something? You see that step by step, each step is a little bit of a process, but you now see what it looks like, and you can, I'm sure you can conquer it if you've been thinking about it. So let's take a look at what we've done. Smartphone, DSLR on a telescope. And that's about where we have time for tonight, probably well over time, I'm guessing. But I want to share with you just very quickly for a minute what we have to offer in astrophotography learning. And this is our annual Astrophotography Conference for the Adirondack Sky Center and Observatory. And I was told that I can shamelessly promote this if I want, but it's a 4-day fully immersive hands-on experience. And the schedule looks generally like this. We have different levels of classes for beginners, intermediate, and advanced. And over the 4 days, you're working in a classroom environment, a computer lab, or out in the field imaging. So here's, just a little bit of initial instruction going on. Here's some discussion. One of the things we've gotten into the habit of doing is eliminating technical problems in a safe environment. We do a setup in the afternoon of equipment if you're having trouble getting your mount to connect to your laptop. We're there and we help you work through that. But basically, our instructors stand right next to you and help you do the things that Gordy helped me do when I first started out. And over 4 days, it's unbelievable what you can come away with. Here's TJ Connolly, who I think spoke for you a few months ago. He's one of our main instructors. And there we are getting set up. We do our imaging at night. The next day we come back in and we do the processing in a computer lab. We provide you with files that have gone through some processing already in case you don't come with files of your own or you haven't collected. But generally speaking, the images that we work on in the computer lab are the ones that you took the night before. So it's your own stuff. You get to help, we help you diagnose what's right and what went wrong with your photos. Our friends often come along. Here's again, just some setup going on. Andrew Metz is one of our instructors also. back in the computer lab for processing, some theoretical stuff as the world was moving from DSLRs to CCD to CMOS. We had our friends from Copernic Observatory come up and join us for instruction during the course. Getting ready for more imaging that night. TJ helping somebody on processing, helping somebody with their mount in the field. And that's where we are. We're standing right next to you in the field with your equipment, helping you get set up. Computer lab, again, it's this constant cycle of imaging and processing and learning, full application. TJ is one of our main instructors. Our friends Art and George from Copernic Observatory come in also and help us do the instruction. But I, again, created this because of my experience early on. I know that there's no way that you can learn how to collect the data for your images when you're out in the dark by yourself in the cold. You have to have somebody there with you showing you this is why this isn't working, or here, try this setting instead. And then like a miracle, an image appears on the screen of your camera. And it's such a satisfying feeling to do that and then go to a computer lab where we help you process that in terms that you can understand and make it look like something. So that's my deal. I'm the person spreading the word. If I can do it, I bet you can do it too. So don't be afraid. There's nothing to fear in astrophotography. That's all I have for tonight. So thank you again for letting me go. Again, by my clock, I've been talking for about an hour and 45 minutes. I don't know if I'm sure that's overtime, but.
And Seth, too, I would add about your conference that people come with a variety of different hardware. I mean, we saw some nice scopes in those pictures there. Some people have some nice scopes, but people also come and do wide field with the DSLR and their own, DSLR lens. They're not all using full size telescopes and expensive equipment.
Yep, that's a great point, Steve. Thanks for mentioning that. In fact, there's people who ask if they could come and use our equipment, and yes, that's a possibility also. We make arrangements for anything that we can, from beginners, if you've never done it before, to very advanced users. I mean, Steve is a great astrophotographer. He's come up and, regardless of level, experience, ability, we have people from all over the country at this point coming. And more than all over the country. We had a guy from South America last year. Well, not 2020. For some reason, we canceled it in 2020. I can't remember why. Oh, yes.
Yeah, we did have somebody ask, do you have dates yet for 21 and 22?
Not quite yet. What we typically try to do, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can get back into the real world here. What we try to do is find a new moon somewhere in late September, early October, and target that time. That has tended to interfere. I want to say it the other way, but the reality is that there's some Jewish holidays in there, and there's some other things that happen in there. Columbus Day is in there too. So it's a little bit of a delicate balance. Our friends at Copernic have an event that goes on at around that time. So we haven't nailed in a time yet. We haven't really, we don't know what's going to happen in this coming year. I hope that we're free to do it. But if not, we may try some virtual version of it this year. I don't really know yet. I'm planning on late September, early October, as we have in the past. That's as much as I can commit to at this point.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Seth. That was very thorough and informative. It was great.
When thorough, that usually means I went way too long.
That's fine. It's fine.
I told him he
Thank
could have
you
as much as he
again.
wants.
Well,
Indeed. Yeah, that was absolutely marvelous.
I can talk all night about this stuff. And again, my background as a teacher, I think really kind of lends itself to want to encourage people to just take the leap. If you haven't done it yet, right in your own club. I mean, those images that we saw right off the bat, you guys are doing some great imaging. What a pool of resource right there. So ask the questions.
We did have a question earlier. I don't know if Jay is still here or not, but the question was, what's the difference between a barn door and something like an Ioptron?
Um, I don't know. I'm not familiar with the barn door.
Yeah, it's usually, you can imagine a hinge that's driven by a drive screw. So essentially you mount your camera on a plate and the drive screw pulls the camera across a hinge.
Yes, yes. I don't know, other than to say that I find the Sky Tracker, the Ioptron, and there's two versions of it. I think a Sky Tracker and a Sky Watcher. I think is the
That's another
name.
brand, yeah.
Yeah. They seem to be insanely accurate, in my opinion. I've done some extremely long exposures with the Sky Tracker, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. You'd have to pry it out of my cold, dead hands in order to
Well, I
get
did
it.
notice a few interesting changes on this. I think it's a Skywatcher that are interesting. One of which is you pointed out the polar mount, and I think if I've read this correct, this is a very casual look at it. I think that the other mount has a device on the back where you set the date and time, and then you put Polaris in the center.
Oh, that's great.
So that's kind of cool. And the other thing is that it had a whole bunch more tracking speeds. The Ioptron generally has ×1, which is normal star tracking. It has ×2, which is approximate star tracking, but slightly better ground imaging.
Mhm.
And then it has sun and moon tracking. This other one added several other, I think even up to a ×12 tracking limit. So it's about 7 or 8 different speeds. So it's kind of neat. I have no idea about the price difference or anything. And I also think that at least earlier, it was like almost impossible to get an Ioptron. It was sort of like a PS5, you ordered it and waited.
One of the things that comes up, and I want to say I just saw the question come across the chat, is if you can guide with the Sky Tracker. And the answer is, on the model I have, the answer is no. You can't use a guide camera. But I don't know on some of the newer models if that feature has been built in.
There are some that have auto guide ports. It's only going to guide, I think, in the right, the RA direction. I don't think it can guide in declination.
Okay.
But that's still, generally speaking, better than having no guiding at all.
Yeah. I'll tell you one feature upgrade that I wish they would make is on the reticle scope that we use for the polar alignment on the Sky Trackers. If it had a diagonal on it.
Oh God, yes.
Yeah.
My back
bending underneath them.
I just can't. I can't do it.
Any one of those car rollers, like when you roll underneath your car to change the oil.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah. The other thing that's really good to have is if your camera has an articulated view screen. I don't know if a lot of DSLRs have that. My Canon, it's like a point and shoot basically. It doesn't have interchangeable lenses, but it does have that, and that is I wouldn't be without that.
I just envy you guys who even have live view on the back. I don't even get that.
Yeah, this is Jim Webster. I'm a guest from down in Toms River. Just to add to the Sky Guider, on the Sky Guider Pro model, there's an individual by the name of Peter Zinkler that you can find, if I'm saying his last name correctly, on YouTube.
The link
He does go into the guiding aspect on the Sky Guider Pro.
He seems to be about the only one too.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. I have the Pro model and I'm quite pleased with it. I've done wide field and some 135 millimeter shots with it, and time lapse.
I've got an angle viewfinder, an old Minolta angle viewfinder, and I got a little adapter that I plug into the back of the polar scope. But so far, it hasn't really proven to be very beneficial because I can't get the alignment right, or there's something not quite right with the optics part of it. So it's not as much as I had hoped it was going to be, because not only can I not bend my neck, but when I do, I have a tendency to fall over.
I've had the that same issue, and I ended up throwing that option that I bought away.
Yeah,
It came in from the UK when I got it.
yeah.
And how I got around that was I ended up getting a bigger camera tripod, and
Just went up.
Yeah.
Yep. pretty much that, and it's been
Yeah.
fine. Now, what they've also done with the SkyGuider Pro, and I don't have that, is they've had now a built-in like pole master in it now.
Nice.
The SkyGuider Pro 2A, the one with the Wi-Fi connection in it, it's not working yet with the newer versions of the Android.
Right.
I actually had an old Android phone sitting around and I can use that, but I can't use the new Android.
Right.
And when I talked to them, they said it could be 3 to 6 months or even more before they, pardon me, slides, even 3 to 6 months or even more before they got a software update from their vendor.
Wow. You know, I think it's important to mention for just for the record that the SkyGuider, Sky Tracker, all of those mounts require the polar alignment, but any tracking mount, regardless of how inexpensive or expensive, they all will require
Yes.
polar alignment. So
Very much.
kind of make that clear for the record, just in case I'm testifying in Congress about it sometime later.
Yeah, I have one of those mounts, but it's very small. And I don't even remember the brand, and I had trouble finding it. And I finally called the manufacturer and looked around. Yeah, we got one left. So I apparently have the last one. It's like it's smaller. It's about the size of the palm of your hand or something,
Wow.
and
So those
it
trackers
just has
are
a
nice.
hole for polar alignment. But you know, it does. I think it does half speed and full speed and reverse for south and.
Yeah, my
But it's-
first one might be that one that you have. It's an Ioptron, I think, and it really, yeah, just it had a hole. The hole is actually meant to hold a polar align scope that you can actually put into it, but not all the
this
models
is much smaller. It's just
necessarily
a
came with
tiny
it.
little hole.
It's
Oh,
funny,
okay.
you know, on the astrophotography exchanges, you know, on Facebook or whatever, somebody mounts a picture of or post a picture of a mount and says, "Does anybody know what this is?"
Yes.
I love those.
Oh, that's not the only place. I'm in several machining groups, and people post a picture of a lathe and like, has anybody seen this before?
Oh my God.
Oh,
That's great stuff.
Well, we started with
Okay.
60 people, and the vast majority of them stayed the whole way through, Seth. So I think you kept a lot of people's
Yeah.
interest, which is good.
really?
Yeah, half of them are still here.
Even now, we still have
Um,
30, yeah.
So basically, say, does anybody else have any questions for Seth before we just go to the informal talk about anything? Everybody's welcome to stay.
I guess Eric,
Very
does
cool.
you want to stop the Facebook recording then, since we'll go into casual mode
Yep.
here?
Is Eric still awake?
I'm awake. I'm going to do that.
But I do have a question to start off the discussion,
Go for it, Jeff.
if you're ready. What is an equatorial flip?
Meridian flip?
Yeah, meridian flip.
Meridian, I beg your pardon, a meridian flip.
Yeah, same thing. But
Ah,
Yeah.
when you have a telescope on an equatorial mount, and the telescope is on one side, the counterweight's on the other side. When you get halfway, the telescope is now below the counterweight, and it'll start actually going down underneath the mount. Now you can keep going like that on some, depending on where you're pointing, but some places you can't. The telescope is going to hit something, so you have to flip it over to the other side. So in other words, you
kind of
turn it
like
all the way around in declination so that it's
Yeah.
pointed the other way, and yeah.
Oh, okay.
Typically,
I'm
what'll
just trying to
happen,
get it in my head. I get it now. I see.
Yeah, it's usually around the meridian, just past the meridian. You have to flip it around to the other side.
what you know, usually the equatorial mounts have a slew limit on them also. So
Yeah.
even if it doesn't smash into the legs of your tripod, it's going to stop at a certain point. And if you want to keep imaging, you would have to flip to the other side to continue. It's a little bit of
Or
a
if
trick
you've
and
got a nice
process
long image
because,
frame in the back, it takes that out.
what's that?
So, or if you have a long image train on the back, like on an SCT, you tend to have a
Oh,
couple,
yeah.
you know, a foot hanging off the back. You can sometimes take out your camera.
Yeah, never fun.
Interesting. So how